Before Pikmin and Splatoon, before Metroid and Zelda, before Super Mario Bros., there was a little game called Punch-Out! But where is it now? And in this age, where Nintendo are resurrecting their older franchises, will Nintendo ever decide to put Little Mac and Company back into the ring? Originally developed for arcades and Nintendo's handheld Game & Watch series, Punch-Out! Was first developed by Genya Takeda, who would ultimately come to be known for directing hardware for many years and who briefly co-led Nintendo with Shigeru Miyamoto in the days after Satoru Iwata's death and before Tatsumi Kimishima was formally appointed as his successor. Nintendo of America chief Minoru Arakawa was so impressed by the skill of the young and not yet champion Mike Tyson that they even secured his likeness for the versions of the NES game, and it became Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, though non-Tyson editions also exist. The game returned twice more on the Super NES as Super Punch-Out! And once more by Next Level Games for the Wii in 2009. Nevertheless, the series has never fallen fully from Nintendo's attention. In 2014, Little Mac became a playable character in Super Smash Bros., and in 2024, the Nintendo Museum opened, and fans were excited to note the cameo on a museum mural. One rather curious case is the NES and SNES mini consoles, which also had Punch-Out!, but in the American, though not the Japanese, editions, which is rather curious. It's not clear if it's memory limitations or simply wishing all the international versions of the classic consoles had the same number of titles on, but Punch-Out! Was one of 5 US exclusive titles. Although the titles are different, the US and Japanese versions do seem to have some degree of parallelism, and they both have the same total number of titles. For example, each region has its own version of Street Fighter on the SNES Mini, its own version of Final Fantasy on the NES Mini, its own third-party action game in Castlevania and Legend of the Mystical Ninja, and their own iconic Nintendo RPG in Earthbound and Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. Therefore, on the SNES, with soccer being a far more important sport in Japan than the US, it would make sense, when considering a US equivalent, to look for another sport with more American popularity when replacing it. And so it makes sense they came up with boxing. The NES Mini's closest sporting equivalent is NES Open Tournament Golf, the forerunner to Mario Golf, and Downtown Neketsu March Super Awesome Fields Day. So I guess that they decided in the West that Punch-Out! Would be a good substitute for one of those. It should be noted that Punch-Out! Isn't the only significant Nintendo franchise to be shunned by Japan, as Kid Icarus, Donkey Kong Jr., and Star Tropics were also dropped from Japan, but did make their way to the mini consoles in the West. My guess is that someone in Nintendo of America made the case strongly for Punch-Out!, but there wasn't quite the same confidence that the series was sufficiently well remembered in Japan to be worth another tilt. Of course, the games are now available on Nintendo Switch Online, and so Nintendo can judge for themselves how much they are played in the different regions and where their markets may lie. In terms of sales expectations, the last Punch-Out! Game was a modest performer. Releasing in July 2009, its last recorded profits were 1.14 million. Although this was at least significant enough to warrant reporting on at over a million copies sold, this was on the lower side for Nintendo's Wii exploits, and a look down the lower selling Wii franchises gives you a list of series that entered a long hiatus thereafter. Metroid Prime 3, Poker Park, and Wario Land Shake It were also in the low 1 millions. I think we can assume that Nintendo made a judgment that Punch-Out! Was not in a position to bring them out of their 2010s sales slump. Now, that's not to say that they never would look at Punch-Out! That way. Several things motivate Nintendo to bring back old franchises after they seem to be done. One would be a new play mechanic or angle that might give the series new success. The Wii version itself was an obvious one based on the success of the Wii's motion controls. An anonymous developer told Time Extension in 2025 there needs to be a new gameplay hook to make another. The Wii controls combined with how old the game was made it a perfect fit to make Wii Punch-Out! That article also explored one of the particular controversies surrounding the title, that of being perceived to perpetuate cultural stereotypes. This began as an anecdote from games journalist Imran Khan that a drunk Punch-Out employee had once related to him that, in Khan's words, there was more backlash against the characters of the Wii game than they expected, and this team spent a lot of time assuring Nintendo that they weren't leaning into bad stereotypes that would get called out this time. It was certainly the case that Nintendo were prickly about the potential for these stereotypes to backfire. One source told Time Extension, "We faced quite a few challenges on the Wii version in regard to avoiding or perpetuating cultural stereotypes, things like Great Tiger's mysticism or Aaron Ryan's brusque Irish mannerisms just made the cut after a lengthy debate. Previous characters like Kid Quick were cut due to their dated representation and instead replaced with more modern original characters like Disco Kid. Some stereotypes we actually leaned into, like Bear Hugger, since we were a Canadian developer and felt comfortable doing so." End quote. The element that doesn't seem to be backed up is the idea of any specific backlash after the game release, but the wording of the original Khan post seems to imply that this backlash could well have been within Nintendo rather than anything more significant, and to Nintendo, one person being deeply offended is a potentially big story. They must have feedback from different people, so even if one person complained, I can imagine the original developers hearing about it. Of course, nearly 20 years on, the world is both far more acutely aware of stereotypes, but also there are far more people that Nintendo would feel able to consult in order to navigate a course through. Threading the needle of light-hearted without being mocking and iconic without being reductive is obviously something that would cause concern, but I think Nintendo could do it if they wanted to. Nintendo is generally extremely reluctant, especially in foreign markets, of pushing anything that could even be perceived to cause offense. The non-translation of Mother 3 and the long delay of Advance Wars 1 plus 2 Reboot Camp are other examples of where they have judged discretion to be the better part of valor. This hasn't stopped re-releases of the very old games, but that's a different matter. For one thing, Nintendo can reasonably say that these are simply remnants of their time, but also they were far more directly involved in the development and can justify it by themselves. There's also the fact that Nintendo has more recently initiated their own first-party fighting titles in ARMS, and this is definitely a passion project for several of its core people at the prestigious Mario Kart development group. Still, the developers of that title were keen to differentiate it from Punch-Out, and despite the superficial similarity, the puzzle-style Punch-Out gameplay doesn't have much similarity to ARMS. Another problem here is that Punch-Out on the Wii launched fairly anemically with only 19,000 copies sold in the territory of Japan, making it the 444th ranked game in its launch week. While it probably did a lot more over time, that's a pretty devastating debut for any Nintendo game, and since Nintendo primarily sees things through the lens of Japan, it's understandable that they would need extra motivation to build up Punch-Out. Of course, we know from a recent Metroid Prime 4 interview that Nintendo of America has requested games including a Metroid Prime sequel previously. Indeed, in 2009, Miyamoto confirmed Nintendo of America has been asking for a new version of Punch-Out for a long time as well. It's completely possible that America could make a case for a Punch-Out game once again. That difficulty, though, is on what grounds? Certainly, an outsized sales history isn't a reason, and if Metroid Prime 4 fails to impress in Japan, and if Advance Wars 1 plus 2 Reboot Camp was also an American request and didn't exactly wow in sales, Nintendo may feel even less willing to consider the US perspective in their decisions. The Mike Tyson association is no longer the most salubrious, and Tyson, in any event, seemed to feel put out that he wasn't consulted by Nintendo on them issuing a sequel. This might also stop Nintendo wanting to make another such partnership. Anyway, while the game has some niche cachet, it's not like it's a beloved American classic by the country at large. From the Japanese point of view, many of the people involved in the original have retired, but there remains Makoto Wada. He's been at Nintendo for 40 years, but started as the character designer for Punch-Out, though in recent years he's been working as the scripter on the Pikmin and Animal Crossing games. One imagines he's not short of work on those franchises these days, and of course he wasn't involved in Punch-Out on Wii. This is probably because the work was conducted in Canada under the supervision of Kensuke Tanabe, but also, looking at his Iwata Asks interview from 2009, it's clear that this was an early opportunity for him, but it's not clear that the game was his initiative or his deepest passion, and he only had a special thanks credit on the Wii title. Coordinator Yuji Ichijo is still at the company, most recently having worked with Ubisoft on the Rabbids games and Advance Wars 1 plus 2 Reboot Camp. Then there's Akira Sakamoto, a project manager who has a long history with Next Level Games. Many of the other people involved shepherding the 2009 game are now either in new roles or else Punch-Out seems like a real footnote for their CVs now. The storyboarder for the 2009 game is now on Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, for example. It's not obvious to me that there's any single person with a deep passion for Punch-Out in Japan. Therefore, my guess is that if Punch-Out does return, it will be largely initiated once again by America, but the US leadership has changed drastically. Devon Pritchard is the president and Satoru Shibata the CEO. Does this sever the dream of more Punch-Out? Well, maybe not. Let's take a look. Project manager and the seeming lead of Punch-Out's development from the US perspective, Todd Bukele, was the associate producer most recently on Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp and is still receiving special thanks on Nintendo-produced games. I wouldn't read too much into this, as it seems like he's the regular point person for Next Level Games' titles in general. The business development links on the game most likely to have been pushing it, Mike Fukuda and Tom Prata, both seem to have left. Prata did have a special thanks on Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, but given that game's lengthy development, that's probably not too significant. With America now under the aegis of Satoru Shibata, Japan may have a far tighter direct control than it has had since 2004. Still, there is one rather curious special thanks in the 2009 Punch-Out game's credits that might give cause to assume that all is not lost. Specifically, Devon Pritchard. Now, this might not seem like such a big deal until you consider that she doesn't actually have very many credits on games at all. As far as I can tell, she has received special thanks on exactly 4 titles: Metroid Prime Remastered, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, and Disney Illusion Island, as well as 2009's Punch-Out. Why she was specially thanked remains unclear, but it might suggest that there's at least a candle flicker of interest in nurturing the series from her. So far then, it's a fairly bleak picture for poor old Punch-Out. Of course, it's not just about the interest to make the game, but how easy a game would be to produce and what the market opportunity is. And here, things look decidedly up for Little Mac fans. Punch-Out Wii would be an obvious and relatively low-effort HD port. A simple remaster would do the trick, and with Nintendo's history of these kinds of games, it would probably sell at $40 or $50, meaning that it would be a relatively affordable option in the vein of Switch Sports. But unless the remasters were very high effort, it might still have a decent profit margin. It could also go out on the original Switch and keep servicing that console for a little while longer. Nintendo has made a deal with Forever Entertainment involving bringing games to Switch, and 2025's Donkey Kong Country Returns HD was the first fruit born by the partnership, but probably not the last. Nintendo has other studios focusing on port work, such as Grezzo of Miitopia fame, and 2 teams within Tantalus, the Zelda Group, and the team that brought over Luigi's Mansion 2 HD in 2024. Still, what other classics are there now on the Wii that they might bring over? Most of these are games which either have sequels on Switch already, or else, like Link's Crossbow Training or Refit, feel decidedly of their time. Others, like Captain Rainbow, may be too niche. Some games already have remakes, such as Kirby Return to Dreamland Deluxe, and if you count it due to the inclusion in Metroid Prime Trilogy, Metroid Prime Remastered. In the case of WarioWare, the minigames could be cannibalized into new titles, much like with the Mario Party series approach to remakes, and it would almost certainly do better this way. Donkey Kong Barrel Blast has popular mascot appeal, but the game was poorly received, same with Metroid Other M. These games might be of interest on a future Wii app for Nintendo Classics if such a thing became possible, but I can't see them being discrete releases. I also think the Pokémon Company will handle ports of their own titles if they wish to do so. Therefore, if you drew up a short list of games that are plausible ports, and you know Nintendo has, I'd guess the list would probably include Excite Truck and Excitebot, Super Paper Mario, Battalion Wars 2, Kirby's Epic Yarn, Sin and Punishment Star Successor, Wario Land Shake It, and Punch-Out. Of these, I'd guess Kirby's Epic Yarn would be a better seller. Super Paper Mario might be more likely to be handled internally, and the rest have the problem that if the games have any kind of success, the creators are largely in the wind, and so it would be difficult to follow up. With Punch-Out, they at least still do have the team at Next Level Games, even though it is a significant time since they worked on anything to do with Punch-Out. There's also a great opportunity here to actually do something new with the game through game chat. Online multiplayer is a big focus at the moment, and it's easy to imagine Punch-Out being a useful marketing tool for the system, with granddads and granddaughters being filmed sparring across the country over game chat. This is the kind of reason Nintendo looks for to go back to a well. It's the reason Punch-Out probably came to Wii with motion controls, the idea that it can be used to demonstrate a new facet of the system and to engage people in interesting and different ways. Of course, this would take it from a remaster to something closer to a new title. Almost certainly Next Level Games would have some oversight. Now, Next Level Games have been quiet recently, but I expect that's just because they're putting a huge amount of effort into Luigi's Mansion. They also have a multiplayer focused team, but generally these are based on team sports mechanics, as with Mario Strikers and Metroid Prime Federation Force. Punch-Out, even back in 2009, was a little outside their usual wheelhouse. As they expand, I could see it being a side project they take on, but it also feels like a massively low priority overall, certainly compared to Luigi's Mansion, which will probably intersect with Nintendo's multimedia aspirations, including with a theme park area and a film. If Nintendo did a Forever Entertainment port, it would be a quick one and done, but since Switch 2 is unlikely to be capable of sustaining multiple Punch-Out entries, it might be an odd choice to do this. I think ultimately a fuller Next Level Games new edition that cannibalizes the old gameplay into something new and something that they could sell for nearly twice the price is probably more plausible, but this would make it a far lower priority for the company and indeed for Next Level Games themselves. Now, that team have long alternated their multiplayer and Luigi's Mansion games, so on that old schedule, we might expect another multiplayer game in 2029, but given the changes of the company and the fact that Punch-Out doesn't easily fit into this team sports mold anyway, it could be later or pushed out of any kind of regular schedule entirely. Ultimately, I think there will be another Punch-Out game, and I think Nintendo does care enough to do it right and make it a full featured sequel, rather than just burning it off as a minimal effort port or dumping it on Wii Classics. However, I can't imagine that it's anybody's current priority. I would give Punch-Out a 10% shout at returning before the end of 2027. Once Luigi's Mansion is released, though, which I would estimate to be around 2027 or 2028, I could see Punch-Out being a smaller side project at Next Level Games, and so I think there's a 30% chance that we could see a title released in this series by the end of 2030. I won't predict any further into the future, but I would guess that the most likely window would be the early 2030s as a late-stage Switch 2 game where it can leverage the large install base and hope to use Punch-Out's greater casual appeal to expand the platform's reach in the US market especially. For more deep dives including on Kid Icarus, Sin and Punishment Developers Treasure, and more, do check out the videos on screen, and if you want to support the channel, checking out the Patreon is always appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.